Well, thank you, Dr. Mlinovic, for an incredibly impressive and focused presentation which has moved us all. The final presentation is from Dr. Roger Scruton from the UK, a formidably distinguished philosopher and political scientist who has written and published more than 40 books, mainly on political philosophy and aesthetics. He's currently a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He taught for many years at the University of London, the University of Boston, before becoming a full-time writer and consultant. I suppose most relevantly and immediately for today's purpose, he was, during the 1980s, someone who played an absolutely central part in founding and supporting underground universities here in Prague, in Brno, and in Bratislava. Dr. Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, to the organizers of the Forum 2000 for inviting me. And of course, thank you to President Havel for having created this institution and also filled not just this institution but this country with his spirit. Pár slov česky. Chtěl bych mluvit.
Couple of Czech words. I would like to speak Czech, but my Czech is powerless. My Czech is powerless, so for that reason I will continue in English. And I have to point out, I am the last Englishman.
And I am here, I suppose, as an exception to everybody on the platform, in that I come from a country which has not for 300 years suffered the kind of totalitarian control and dictatorship that people have suffered in this part of the world. And I'm a beneficiary of what George Orwell called the eccentric English habit of not killing each other. And it is true that we do look, from the point of view of the international order, extremely eccentric. And I came here first in 1979 as an eccentric Englishman to talk to a private seminar in Prague where people had assembled to discuss philosophy. And I believed, because I taught philosophy in a university, I believed that philosophy was an easygoing, open-minded way of discussing difficult questions with a free mind. And then, of course, I arrived here in a seminar to discover that doing that thing was dangerous, that all the people who had assembled to hear what I had to say ran a risk, precisely because they were pursuing the question of what is true and what is not true about some issue of the day. When I came home, I was advised to read this great essay by Václav Havel on the Moc bez mocných and consider just what it meant. And I think that as I came here regularly after that to meet people who were involved in attempting to maintain some kind of educational structure underground, I came to see that this essay has very important messages, not just for people living under totalitarian regimes, but also for us who lived in the free world, as it was then known, and who had the ability and the freedom to discuss things openly among ourselves. And the way I read this essay, I drew from it three conclusions. First, that there is a power that grows from below, as well as the power that is imposed from above by armies and governments and so on. There's another power that grows from below, which is much more important to the human spirit, although much more feeble from the point of view of the physical world. And that is the power of trust. trust between people, which is a frail commodity, easily destroyed, but also constantly regrowing. And that trust is what I found in the private seminars of people, many of whom were known to Václav Havel, in the Prague of the 1980s. Another lesson that I learned from this essay is that even when people do not trust each other, they can still learn to live in another way. And that was the way that Havel called living within the lie. And his famous example of the greengrocer, we have a greengrocer next to us here, I think brought this home to us all, that it is possible, of course, to live within the lie, live comfortably, but yet deeply inside oneself, not to be at ease with oneself, not to be really deeply spiritually comfortable with oneself. And I think that was a very important message. Finally, this essay conveyed to me the thought that the written word, the word written down on a piece of paper, is an extremely powerful weapon. And it has an important role in creating the space in which people can, once again, live within the truth. Through passing the written word around from one person to another, we learn that indeed words have a weight beyond their sound, a weight which makes them in some sense immortal. And I think the people that I met in the 1980s in Prague were people who had been inspired by that idea, inspired by the thought that there is a truth contained in books, in poetry, in words that have been written at a great personal cost to the person who wrote them, words which, as it were, perpetuated the human spirit of the person who produced them. And those words are worth more than anything else that we can give to each other. That thought was extremely inspiring to somebody like me, coming from the free world, with who had no familiarity with this particular totalitarian regime. And it gave rise to the thought that indeed the totalitarian regime has something very positive to be said for it, namely that it makes truthfulness into something dangerous. There's a cost attached to it, and therefore you are able to see for the first time clearly the absolute value of truth. Okay, it's not a nice way to be persuaded of the value of truth, but we in the West were very easily tempted to lose sight of the value of truth completely. Academic discourse, as I had learned it in my university, did not focus on this question of the importance of truth as the aim of human thinking. It was quite indifferent as to whether someone was speaking truth or speaking ideology. And I think this is another lesson that I drew from Havel's life and from his writings, that our words can be directed in two quite conflicting directions, towards the truth about ourselves and the world we live in, or towards power. And when words are directed towards power, they become ideology. And the most important form of ideology in our experience in the 20th and 21st century has been Marxism, which was dominant in this part of the world and also dominant in my university in England in the 1980s. So it was the first time when I came here that I saw clearly that I'd been living also amid people who preferred lies to the truth. But I could only see it because here the truth had this extraordinary cost attached to it. And it was a cost that Havel was prepared to pay. So I think there are some lessons that I would like to draw from that essay, which are still relevant in the world in which we live. As I say, I can't talk of an experience such as that of Burma or Cuba or Belarus or the old a Czech experience under communism. I've come from a country which is has always been free, has always valued free discussion, and has always valued political order built from below instead of from above. Nevertheless, I think now that there is another kind of political order here, it's still necessary to draw lessons from what Havel was telling us. First of all, I think we should remember that there's a constant temptation to aim our thinking towards power instead of truth, to say things, to read things, to write things in order to obtain influence or social position, rather than simply to say how things are. And I think to aim at truth, we need intellectual humility, not to think of ourselves as having some ability once again to create a total order for the world, a complete system under which everything can be governed, but to recognize that words are finite things which only reach so far. And I think learn, therefore, to speak quietly but honestly. And I think one thing that Havel showed us in his life is that in a real crisis, it's the person who has that still, small voice of humanity, who speaks truth, even though quietly and to the few people whom he can trust. That's that person who really matters. It's he who will emerge in a crisis as the one person to whom we can entrust the power and the destiny of our nation, which is what you Czechs wonderfully did in that crucial moment when you might have gone completely wrong and imitated all your neighbors. And instead, you actually appointed as your first president a genuinely educated, morally decent, and truth-following person. And I think that for that reason, we ought to constantly remind ourselves of the example that Havel has given us, which is an example from which I think all of the world, and especially Europe, can learn. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roger, for those extremely thoughtful messages which we're going to long be pondering. We have now half an hour for questions, comment, and discussion. I would like there to be a little bit of focus, if possible, on the future of this forum and the future of the Havel legacy, how best to shape and channel the ideas and the themes that we've been talking about. But we'll see what happens in the discussion. Do any of the panelists want to say anything at this stage in response to anything that has been said by anyone else? Or should we go straight to the floor? You want to speak? Karol Schwarzenberg.
Well, I just would like to shortly come back to the message of Roger. Of course, the fight for truth was elementary for Václav Havel, and it was a key word in everything he wrote.